Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I run a private campground. It's a special place. You can lose yourself in the woods in a way you can't anywhere else, and perhaps in doing so, you can find yourself again. People come here not to refresh and recharge, but to feel whole. The land, after all, has a heart, and I think if you listen hard enough you can hear it beating out there with the wind whispering in the leaves. I wish this didn't come with a price to pay. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning, and if you're totally lost, this might help. I think I've figured out where the harvesters are drawn from. They're clearly modeled after my family. They're never around when you need them, and they only show up when they want something from you. Okay, that was mean. I shouldn't be so rude as to compare the harvesters with my family. The harvesters have actually helped me, after all. You're probably thinking, oh dang, Kate had to eat a coffee mug at an ant's face this time or something. Nah, nothing has changed with the family situation. I'm just a bit salty about the whole thing, especially since the rumor mill is working at full capacity and I'm getting concerned phone calls from relatives wanting to know if I'm handling the stress of the campground okay. Not that they want to help out in any meaningful way. They just want to make sure campground management isn't going to collapse on them. And believe me, I gave them opportunities to lend a hand. No one wants to look for the harvesters though. Best I got out of them was some food dropped off that I can easily reheat so I don't have to cook this week. Maybe I'm being too harsh. I can't blame people who don't have immunity like me for not wanting to look for the harvesters. And it is nice to have dinner taken care of. I'm just frustrated. Inhuman things tend to only be found when they want to be found, and the harvesters clearly have no interest in taking responsibility for whatever the hell they spawned. They're still on the campground. I know this because they ambushed some hapless camper and took his birthmark. Like, just cut it right out of his arm. I got there as fast as I could, but apparently the harvesters are practicing hit and runs now because the whole surgery took not even 5 minutes. I showed up to find a rather bewildered camper mopping blood off his arm around a mud-encrusted wound. I gave him this "so you've had an encounter with an inhuman thing" information packet and told him he might want to start seeing a dermatologist, just in case the harvesters were giving him a hint. In the meantime, I've been trying to figure out how to deal with the rogue harvester on my own. I considered getting a face from the morgue to throw at it, but I'm not sure I want to give it what it wants. That very well could create an even worse problem for me. I'm going to focus on destroying it instead. I'm sure this will make a lot of people happy, but I've invested in a flamethrower. Fire works on all kinds of inhuman things, after all, and we've gotten more than enough rain lately to make it a relatively safe weapon. I've still notified the fire department in advance. It's amazing how cooperative the town has gotten now everyone knows I'm actively trying to get rid of the creatures around here. Of course, I'm sure murdering the Knot brother in front of the whole town didn't hurt me in the respect department either. Fear is a form of respect, right? I haven't had a chance to use the flamethrower though, except on some weeds to practice. The rogue harvester seems to have gone into hiding after the incident with the ears. For a day or so I was actually hoping that the harvesters killed it themselves and it wasn't an issue anymore. But no, I'm not nearly that lucky. One of my staff had a close call with the thing. Fortunately, they were on a four-wheeler and were able to outrun it. They showed up in my office, shaken, but intact. They said it had come out of the woods, running at them, with the tattered raincoat flapping from its shoulders like a cape. Its arms hung limply at its sides as it ran. It shrieked at them, my employee said. It could barely form words anymore, and most of what came out was unintelligible gurgling. But there was one word they were able to make out. Mine. After that, my employees said, they floored the gas and got out of there as fast as they could. I reached for the bottle of Tylenol as soon as they left to ward off the inevitable headache this was going to become. Our biggest event starts soon. I didn't have the time to let this problem linger. It was time to take drastic action. Some of you have asked about monster hunters and whether we get any on the campground. Let me just say that yes, that is such a thing, but it is unlikely to be what you're thinking. I don't go digging out a business card that has only a number on it, make a call to someone with a voice like they survive only on whiskey, and a few days later a rugged and mysterious man with a tortured backstory arrives carrying a katana and a pistol loaded with silver bullets. I do make a phone call, but it's to one of the locals. And I do get people showing up on my campground, but they're rugged because they work in the fields and their tortured backstories involve getting caught skinny dipping in the cow pond by their high school crush. That's right. I call it the good old boys and girls. There's a handful of people around here that are willing to form up a hunting party if I promise to throw in some celebratory beer and a bounty on the monster. They're the folks that hunt and eat the deer and wild pigs on their land, and the same families my parents recruited and my grandparents recruited when they needed more hands. I got 6 to show. 5 men and 1 woman. They all came armed with shotguns, as most of the time the monsters show up with not a lot of range to take a shot, but they had their rifles slung over a shoulder regardless. The campground was closed that day, as I'm not taking open camping until after the big event comes and goes. It was the perfect opportunity to take care of this problem. I asked the old sheriff if he'd be willing to provide long-range support, but he promised to take his wife on a date. Instead, I'd be their support. Not with a rifle, of course. I'm actually not a very good shot. There's a reason I rely on a shotgun. Rather, I'd be waiting at the edge of the deep woods with an assortment of weaponry that I hoped would work on the rogue harvester. If they could cripple it, I could show up and finish it off. Then I handed out Hunter Orange charm vests and off they went. They knew the dangers. They knew the risk and they accepted it, each for their own reasons. I was waiting at the top of the hill when someone came walking up out of the deep woods. It was dusk and my hunters had been out for most of the day, but the agreement was that we wouldn't pack it up until after midnight. Yes, hunting monsters at night is a terrible business, but sometimes that's the only time frame we can find them. I stared at the approaching figure long enough to realize who it was before I took my finger off the trigger of my shotgun. Bo. He hasn't been making much of an appearance lately. Sure, he poisoned a few people at the more recent events, but that's not unusual. I'd say he's avoiding me, but it's more likely that he just hasn't had any reason to seek me out. I turned to rearrange the stuff on the four-wheeler so that there was space on the seat behind me. Get on, I said tersely once he was within speaking range. He just raised a studded eyebrow at me questioningly. You always show up when things are going wrong, I elaborated. So get on. We're going to go check on my hunters. Bo didn't move. I stared at him in exasperation, and then my radio crackled. I almost couldn't make out the words over the screaming in the background. His arm, one of my hunters was yelling. It took his arm. Where is it now? I asked tersely. I couldn't let them panic. I don't know. It took off into the woods. Bo watched him passively as I tried to gain control of the situation. I ordered them to stay where they were. We had paramedics on standby. I'd escort them down into the deep woods. In the meantime, They needed to set one person on watch to make sure it didn't catch them off guard again, and the other person needed to work on stopping the bleeding. Then I switched channels and radioed the paramedics to meet me at the hill. They were parked further up towards the field, where it was safer. They were already familiar with the campground, but I wasn't going to ask them to take any more risk than necessary. They should be only minutes away. The road between us was broad enough that a vehicle could travel at reasonable speeds. I waited, heart pounding, and wondered why they weren't here yet. Tersely, I radioed them again. Something hit the ambulance, one responded. Knocked it over. My stomach twisted. This was all going very, very wrong. I managed to get some more information from them. They weren't sure what happened. They were in a patch where the trees crowded in close to the road, and it was dark, as the sun no longer made it through the leaves. Something hit the side of the ambulance, and then, with a groan, the entire vehicle was shoved over. They didn't see what it was. They just stayed in the cab, hearts pounding, but unhurt, until the silence around them convinced them that it was gone. There was a giant dent in the side of the ambulance, they said. Like something huge had smashed into it and then run away. They were pulling supplies out of the back and would come on foot from there. They'd already requested another ambulance squad, but they could at least stabilize the hunter until it arrived. Nervously, I switched channels again and told the hunters that help would be a little delayed in coming. They cursed at me, but there was nothing that could be done for it. They'd do what they could to keep their companion alive, they said grimly. And the whole time Bo just watched me. His expression never changed. I lowered the radio and stared at him. Why was he here? What did he want other than to watch me struggle as all my preparations collapsed around me? You're faltering, he said. This is kind of a lot, I growled in response. It's not just the situation I'm referring to, he replied, idly waving a hand at the campground. You are faltering. I hesitated. Am I? I admit I'm tired. Just tired. All the time. The land is in the process of becoming ancient, and I keep telling myself that I've come so far and beaten so much, but that last mile feels like the longest. I'm only human. I snapped. Only human? It is humans that shape the world. I had no answer to that. He stared down at me with a serene expression. I'm not sure I've ever seen him look that way. I exhaled and looked at my watch. Not yet enough time had passed to justify checking for status updates. I couldn't be bothering them needlessly, not when they had work to do. I could only sit there and wait for the paramedics. It wasn't the paramedics that reached me first. A figure came slouching out of the growing twilight among the trees. Its shoulders were tilted and it walked slowly, dragging each foot. Its arms hung limply at its side underneath a tattered gray raincoat. I raised my shotgun and aimed it squarely at the figure. Its shamble was deceptive. It had to be fast if it had managed to ambush the hunters. It tilted its head to one side and stopped. Quietly, Bo took a few steps back, clearing the path between me and the rogue harvester. His intention was clear. This was mine to deal with. He wanted proof I was still worth backing. Something stirred from within the shadow of the raincoat. A hand emerged, stretching out blood-stained fingers. Then the rest of the arm emerged, protruding from the center of its chest as it arched its spine and its head dropped backwards. The flannel sleeve of the hunter shirt was still wrapped around the arm's bicep. Mine, it croaked. And then it ran at me, its stolen arm steady while the rest of its body flapped wildly from side to side with each step. I fired the shotgun. It pitched to the side, stumbled, and kept coming. I drew my knife just as the creature reached me. Its fingers latched onto my upraised arm, and with my free hand, I stabbed the blade of the knife into the thick muscle of the forearm. We went over backwards. I smelled meat just starting to rot emanating from the inside of its coat. Its faceless head leered over mine as its one arm clenched down harder and harder on my forearm. I gritted my teeth and wrenched back and forth at the knife, trying to weaken its grip before it crushed my bones. Mine, it rasped, and it began to pull. My arm. It was trying to wrench my arm off. My mouth was dry with pain. Anger. I needed my anchor. It was the only strength I had. There was a roar in the distance. A familiar sound. The beast. In a startling moment of clarity, I realized what had knocked over the ambulance. I hadn't been thinking about it just yet because it wasn't an immediate problem. There were more pressing issues, like the hunter bleeding to death down in the deep woods. But now, I belatedly realized what that all meant. The dent. The roar. The beast was hunting my campground tonight. And I was calling it here with my anchor. I ripped the knife free. I frantically sought at the fingers clutching my arm. One fell free. Calm. I had to be calm. But even as my anger began to bleed away, I felt the fear that had held back time and time again start to creep in. It made my hands shake. It turned my muscles into lead. It made it so that I could not take a breath. And all the while, the rogue harvester's stolen hand continued to twist until I thought my arm would pop clean out of its socket. I sobbed out loud and managed to cut away another finger. The beast. Where was the beast? I didn't hear its roar anymore. Was it still coming? I felt paralyzed. I didn't know how to fight like this. I was scared. Just like any naive camper, confronted with the terrible reality that they are nothing but prey for the darkness. I was scared and helpless. There was a flash of movement. Something whistled through the air. And then the grip holding me relented and half of the arm fell heavy onto my chest, the rancid blood quickly soaking into my shirt. It had been severed at the elbow. Bo stood over us, holding his knife at his side. He stared at the rogue harvester impassively as it leapt backwards, shrieking unintelligibly. Then it turned and fled, crouching low to the ground and moving with odd, rolling steps. I've seen such a gait before. Hints of it, at least. I think the yarn balls used to be harvesters. Trembling, I picked myself up. I felt dizzy. I couldn't believe how weak I felt. This was just fear, I told myself. I could shake it off. But what then? What could I replace it with if anger was no longer an option? I turned to Bo, but he was not here to provide me with answers. He wasn't even looking at me. You see, he said calmly, whipping his knife in a downward arc so that the blood was flung off the blade and onto the ground. Faltering. And he walked away, leaving me speechless as the paramedics crested the road, carrying in their arms their supplies. I'm a campground manager and I have a bit of an anger problem. I always have. I wonder if this was deliberate on my parents' part. They never tried to change me. When my temper got the best of me, they sent me outside to chop wood until I was tired. I used my anger to fuel every swing of the axe, just as I used it to fuel my beleaguered body, to fight long past when most people would have given up and accepted their death. But now, I feel I'm damned if I use it and damned if I don't. The beast is clearly growing stronger, and I'm not sure if it's entirely due to my anger. There is clearly a connection. I feel trapped, like it's watching just over my shoulder, waiting for me to call to it so that it might hunt me down and tear me apart. I don't think my anger is what's making it stronger, though. I haven't changed that much. If anything, I've gotten better. It's the land that's changing. It's turning ancient. And I fear that the closer the land gets to that tipping point, the stronger the beast will get. I fear that if I don't destroy it, the beast will rule the land merely by default. And somehow I have to do this without my anger. I exhaled sharply as I lowered the revolver from my temple. Today marks the 5th anniversary of Nadia's disappearance. Hard to believe it's been that long. We had so much time left. So much life to live together. But that all came to a screeching halt half a decade ago on the day we found those stairs. Without her, I have no purpose. I've got no family. No friends. No one to keep me tethered to this world. So, every year on the night that Nadia went missing, I stumble out to the spot that it happened with my 6-shooter in hand, halfway drowned in a handle of vodka, and I let the forest decide if I'm going to live for another year, or if I'm going to be reunited with her. Wherever she is. Now that it's determined that I have at least one more trip around the sun, I'll tell you how I ended up here at rock bottom. I need to get this out while I still have the guts to tell this story. Don't know why, though. I'm going to wake up sometime tomorrow afternoon with a massive headache and no recollection of tonight's events. I'd better tell you while I still can. I've lived on the outskirts of Bear Creek National Park for my entire life. Don't bother looking it up. It's a fake name so nobody tries to seek out the evil that lurks here. It's safer that way. As I was saying, I used to live out here in a cabin with my dad. I miss him so freaking much. He passed away 8 years ago, leaving me all alone. Cancer is a bitch. That was before Nadia and I started dating. It's funny how things work out. I actually met her at a coffee shop on my way back from visiting Dad's grave. When she approached me and asked if the seat across from me was taken, I was instantly smitten. Her deep blue eyes shimmered like the ocean. Long, brown hair cascaded down her shoulders in waves. And that smile. When Nadia smiled, it was as if time stopped, just for a moment, so that the whole world could soak in its breathtaking beauty. We were inseparable after that day. In a month we were dating. In 9 more, we were living together in my cabin. And in another year, we were set to get married. Had a date and a venue picked out and everything. I was on cloud 9. But that was all torn from me in an instant. God, I wish I never would have taken her out there. I had my first encounter with the stairs when I was 7. Dad had always warned me never to climb them. That wasn't a problem for me, though. The stairs exuded a malevolent presence. Like anyone who dared to walk up their steps would be eaten alive from fear alone. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was playing in the woods near the cabin when I saw it. A black, winding set of metal stairs that stretched maybe a story. They didn't lead anywhere. They just kind of ended. All the stairs are like that. They vary in size and shape and model, but the one thing they all have in common is that they don't lead anywhere. And they're never in the same place twice. They just sort of materialize. No one knows how or why, and truthfully, we don't want to know. Most of us, that is. Nadia wanted to know. And that knowledge cost her everything. Come on, baby, just a little further. I want to see the sunset. Nadia whined in protest at my proposal to head back. Naughty, I know you do. But we didn't bring flashlights and our phone batteries aren't worth a crap. I don't know about you, but I don't feel like smacking into trees every few feet on our way home. Oh fine, you win. I'll go back this time. But promise me we can come back tomorrow, she requested, puffing at her lower lip and gazing up at me with her best puppy dog eyes. I'd be lying if I said they hadn't worked. All right. I'll take you back out here tomorrow. But only if you, I trailed off, entranced by the sight of him. Nadia's brows knitted together in confusion as she traced my gaze, then her jaw fell open. Directly before us stood a polished cedarwood staircase. I got a sinking feeling in my gut the moment I laid eyes on that thing. It looked so out of place. Like a rat in a fish tank. What is that thing? Nadia muttered, gaze still fixed to it. It's nothing. I'll tell you later, I said, snatching her hand and leading her in the opposite direction. Ow, Jason, let go. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Tell me what's going on or I'm not moving another inch, Nadia protested, crossing her arms defiantly. I sighed. There was no point in hiding it any longer. She was going to find out eventually. Okay. So, this is going to sound completely unhinged, but please bear with me. Ever since I've lived here, ever since anyone's lived here, really, people have been finding random staircases in the forest. They appear and disappear all the time. And you'll never find one in the same place twice. The stairs are a bad omen. Something awful happens if you climb to the top, but no one quite knows what. All I know for certain is we need to stay far, far away from them. Nadia rolled her eyes in response. Come on, Jay, do you really expect me to believe that? A bad omen? Are you some kind of spiritual medium now? Oh, a staircase, so scary, she said, waving her hands in a mocking gesture. Nadia, do I look like I'm joking? I know it sounds crazy, but I wouldn't lie to you. She softly took my hands into hers and met my gaze. Baby, you know I wouldn't accuse you of that. It's strange, but if it really irks you that much, I won't press it, okay? Thank you. Now, let's go home. I am starving. Once we were out of sight of that wretched thing, I could sense the tension starting to disperse. It was as if a veil had been lifted. I fell asleep that night with a stomach full of dumplings and not a thought in the world besides the petite girl snuggled in my arms. The stairs had vanished from my brain, just like they always did, until the next day. We both had the entire day off work, and before I knew it, Nadia was pulling me back down the same path as the day prior to watch the sunset. Butterflies danced in my stomach as we approached the spot that we'd seen the stairs the day before. Even so, Nadia noticed it first. Hey, isn't this the same place you pulled me away from yesterday? Those stairs, they're gone. See? I told you they're a bad omen. Now do you believe me? I never said I didn't. It's just a strange phenomena, you know? Like seeing a unicorn. You don't really ever expect to find it, or in this case, not find it. It's a lot to process. I didn't know what to say. She hit the nail on the head with her analysis. Except the staircases were no unicorns. No, they were something far more sinister. We continued our walk in silence until we finally reached our destination. That evening will always stand out in my mind. The sky looked like a painter's canvas. A gorgeous amalgamation of purple and pink and orange melted together behind a smattering of light, wispy clouds. I'd never seen anything so picturesque. We stayed there well past the sunset, staring up into a sea of stars illuminating the night sky. Thank you for keeping your promise. Today was perfect, Nadia yawned, sleepily resting her head on my shoulder. Every day with you was perfect. Thank you for dragging me out of the house. This really has been incredible. I love you so much. You're welcome, bonehead. I love you too, Nadia giggled quietly, her eyes struggling to stay open. All right, sweetheart, I think it's time for us to go back. You can hardly stay awake. Just a little longer. You're so comfy, she protested, burying her face into my chest. My heart felt so full in that moment. What had I done to deserve such an amazing girl? All right, up we go, I said, hoisting my weary girlfriend into my arms. If your legs won't move, I have no choice but to carry you. Oh no, how terrible. Whatever shall I do? She quipped, wrapping her arms around my neck. Nothing. Just stay still and let me dash. I froze mid-stride. I swallowed a dry lump in my throat as sweat began to bead atop my brow. In the darkness among the foliage, my flashlight beam fell upon a large, bulky object. They were back. Jason, what's wrong? You look pale, Nadia said, following the ray of light until she realized what I was looking at. A wide set of weathered concrete steps ascended to nowhere. They called to me, begging me to climb them. Just one step. Just one, that's all. Jason, I feel it now. What you were talking about yesterday, I feel it. It's all wrong. They shouldn't be here, Nadia whimpered, fear jolting across her pupils. Yeah, you're right, I said, ripping my gaze from the awful thing. Just don't look at it. We're going to be okay. This time, I wasn't as relieved once we'd escaped the staircase's alluring pull. I'd never seen the stairs 2 days straight before. They were always more sporadic in their appearance, never showing up with any rhythm or consistency, so to see them twice made me a bit uneasy. Nadia and I didn't mention the stairs again that evening. We were both absolutely exhausted, and we were itching to get some much-needed rest. I'd be damned if I was going to let a stupid staircase ruin a good night's sleep. Nadia was already snoring when I joined her in bed, and I was out the second my head hit the pillow. If only we could have made it until morning. Maybe then she'd still be here. I awoke in a pitch-black room. Nadia was missing from her side of the bed. I didn't worry at first. It wasn't abnormal for her to sneak off to the bathroom in the middle of the night every once in a while. I didn't want to drift back off until I had her beside me, though. I waited and waited to no avail. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I finally called out. Hey babe, are you coming back to bed soon? I received no response. That was when the panic set in. Nadia would never ignore me like that. I leapt out of bed and beeline for the bathroom. It was empty. My heart began to pound against my ribcage like a jackhammer. Sirens were blaring in my head, telling me that something was wrong, and I felt helpless to silence them. I turned the whole cabin inside out with no results. Nadia was nowhere to be found. Then, amongst all the chaos, an idea flickered in my head. Why hadn't I thought of it sooner? Nadia's phone was missing from the bedside table, but I could track her location and find my friends. I fumbled to unlock my own phone and open the app. I had to know that she was okay. I loaded up the app and located Nadia's icon. She was close. The app said that she was only a few hundred feet from the cabin. I threw on a pair of shorts and darted out into the frigid night air. I raced, barefoot, across leaves and rocks and acorns. I didn't have time to grab shoes. Right then, I didn't care if my feet were torn to ribbons, as long as Nadia was okay. I eventually reached the point where her phone should have been. I frantically called it, praying that she would pick up this time. I saw something illuminate amongst the leaves. And not far beyond it, I found who I was searching for. But instead of being overcome with joy upon finding the love of my life, my blood turned to ice. Nadia's face was partially illuminated by the moonlight trickling through the canopy. She was gazing down at me with tears streaming down her cheeks. Below her feet sat a staircase. This time, it was ornate. White glassy marble stairs gleamed even in the darkness, topped off with a pristine red carpet. The stairs looked as if they would lead straight to heaven itself. And that terrified me. Dread crashed over me like a tidal wave as we stared at each other. I wanted to move. I wanted to sprint up to her and sweep her off those godforsaken things. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, forced to watch as the girl of my dreams ascended the final step. Jason, please. I don't want to go. I love you and I want to stay with you forever. I had to know. I could feel them calling to me. Please don't let them take me. Nadia sobbed uncontrollably, reaching out a hand toward me. I wanted to grab it, to pull her into my arms, to tell her that everything was going to be okay. But I was stuck. I was forced to watch in abject horror as Nadia involuntarily took that one last step to the top. It felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. 1 second I was paralyzed, eyes locked on Nadia and those vile stairs. And the next, I was all alone. Nadia and the staircase had vanished, whisked into the cool night air like they'd never existed at all. The burden of that night will stay with me until the day I die. I wailed. I screamed. I pounded the earth until my fists were bloody and my throat was hoarse. Nadia had been taken from me right before my very eyes, and I did absolutely nothing. I blamed myself for a long time after that. Hell, I still do. I don't think I'll ever be able to move on. That's my punishment, I suppose. Living out a dull, meaningless life, while images of my lost girlfriend run through my head day in and day out. It's why I drink. Strangely enough, I've never seen the stairs again. They're really the only reason that I'm still here. Because maybe if I just give in, maybe if I convince myself to climb that one last looming step, then there might be a chance that I'll be reunited with Nadia. And for me, that's a chance that I have to take. It was almost 15 years ago now that I first met one of the most interesting people I know. True to that nature, I also met him in one of the most interesting and unexpected ways. I was out hiking on a trail in Washington State. It was a remote area, but one which I was fairly familiar with. On that particular day, I decided to venture far beyond the hiking trail I normally took to just for the sake of exploration. After some time, I entered a sunlit gully which led up to a local mountain, rife with blooming conifers and serene, glistening pines. I was alone that day, and felt my soul rejuvenate a bit with every breath of the fresh mountain air. After probably 20 minutes, I was well off the beaten trail, and I found something worrying. I was about to take another step when I paused mid-stride, seeing a circular, jagged, metal ring lane just behind a small shrub. It was a good thing I didn't put my foot down, as the ring proved to be an improvised bear trap. "The hell you doing out here?" A gruff male voice suddenly shouted from somewhere unseen. I looked around, trying to find the person who had spoken, when he chose to step forward and reveal himself. An older man sporting a long gray beard then emerged from the brush. He had amber skin, long grayish-black dreadlocks, and a scar on his right cheek. He wore a raggedy brown coat that looked hand-woven, and old jeans patched in multiple spots by mismatched fabric. His eyes burned like campfires, and his hands clutched a bolt-action rifle while his lip cradled a sizable wad of chew. "I asked you a question, son. What are you doing here?" After fumbling on my words for a moment, I was finally able to piece together a response. "I was just out hiking. Sorry, I didn't know anyone lived out here." The man seemed to silently inspect me for a moment. I felt my pulse soar in my chest, as I wondered what he intended on doing. We were, after all, completely alone up there. "You see that trap back there, son?" He pointed to the same trap I had narrowly avoided stepping on a minute earlier. I nodded and swallowed hard. He tilted to the side and spewed a mouthful of tobacco spit into the dirt. "Guess that means I gotta hide him better." He stared at me completely deadpan, and I felt my heart plunge into the depths of my stomach. I thought he was some maniac hillbilly cannibal hellbent on having me for lunch then, but then he suddenly burst into a fit of raspy laughter. I was left there confused and partially horrified as the man continued to cackle for several seconds. "Oh, I'm just kidding, son." He wiped a tear from his eye and recomposed himself as I continued silently debating whether or not I should run like hell. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and smiled at me. "Apologies, buddy. My wife always said my sense of humor was a bit dark." I had the man over, and he suddenly seemed less sinister than he had a moment ago. There was a sense of jubilance in his gaze, like he was genuinely happy to see me. It's hard to explain, but it kept me from running. I forced a laugh myself. Good thing for both of us, I guess. This hiking has given me a major case of swamp ass. Can't imagine I taste too good. The man burst out into laughter once more, and this time I joined in. In that moment, I knew I had found a new friend. The man formally introduced himself not long after as Mark Hastings. After conversing for a while, he told me that he had lived in a particular area for a couple years at least, though admitted he didn't know exactly how long he'd been there. He said he left the city life behind in 96 foot, and seemed quite surprised when I told him the current year was 2020. Mark's accent was something which struck me as quite interesting, as it was one I couldn't quite pin down. He had a slight southern drawl and yet at times also sounded as though he may have had a bit of British influence as well. He pronounced words like again as again and had a strange vocal inflection. The best way I can really describe it is the way someone speaks in old black and white movies, proper and yet somehow country. We got to talking and he told me more about himself. He said he used to do construction back in the day, but when his wife got sick with cancer, it really changed things for him. He said she battled it for almost 3 years, but eventually lost the fight. Afterwards, he was left alone and with a mountain of medical bills to account for. Rather than pay them all and attempt to move forward, Mark chose a different path. It's funny, you know. You work your ass off for years, begin building the life you want with the woman of your dreams, and then it all just falls apart for no good reason. Then when you at your lowest, good old Uncle Sam comes in and slaps you with a bill you ain't never gonna pay back. So I say, to hell with them. To hell with their taxes and debt. Out here I am truly free. There ain't nothing left for me in the real world anyways. There was a distinct glimmer of pain behind his gray eyes as he said it, and I felt myself feeling sorry for him. He wasn't at all what I expected when we first met. Just a normal guy whose life fell apart through no fault of his own. In a way, I found it sort of admirable. The system beat him down, and rather than just accept it and be a good little wage slave, he left it all behind with one big middle finger. I visited Mark pretty regularly after that, and tried to make the trek out to see him at least once a month. He always seemed to have a smile on his face when I came to visit. Soon enough, he even invited me back to his cabin for a fresh meal and some drinks. I was a bit hesitant at first, but decided to accept. Part of me expected him to prepare a meal of squirrels and tree bark when he first offered, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Mark made us a fresh rabbit stew with some homegrown potatoes and bread he had made from scratch. On top of it, he even had his own homebrewed ale to wash it all down. It was surprisingly delicious, and really made me admire Mark more for his resourcefulness. He wasn't just some half-assed camper, he was truly a man of the land. His cabin was reminiscent of one that would have been used by early 18th century trappers. A handcrafted stone chimney was his only source of heat, while animal pelts covered the walls and strips of meat were drying on his jerky rack. There were 2 couches in the main room constructed of whittled wood and bearing hand-woven pillows stuffed with feathers. He had no electronics of any kind, claiming he didn't need those technologic doohickeys anyways. Mark had 2 bloodhounds, Riley and Daisy, that lived there with him and were his only real companions. I eventually asked if he ever missed civilization or got lonely out there, but he immediately refuted the question. For a while, yeah, but not anymore. It's easy to forget about society when society already forgot about you. I really grew to admire Mark and even cherish our friendship. Over our many meetings, he would tell me stories about his life. Told me all about his business and his wife before she passed. The way he spoke about her in particular truly broke my heart. He was a man who met his soulmate and built a life he loved with her, only to have it all ripped away by the cruel hands of fate. More than anything, though, Mark was always ready to tell me how much he hated the government. I think that was what made me like him the most. One night he and I were drinking some of his homebrewed honey ale and chilling around his campfire. He had just got done telling his story about a 5-point buck that he had narrowly missed a few weeks earlier. He finished with admitting that he heard some weird, loud noise from the woods that scared it off before he could fire. That detail got me thinking, and since I'd always been a fan of the paranormal and whatnot, I figured I'd go ahead and ask him. You ever seen anything really creepy out here? Mark's eyes opened wide, and he immediately lowered the mug from his lips. He wiped the suds from his bushy beard and stared down at the campfire for a couple seconds. I could tell he knew exactly what I meant. He then chuckled and rocked in his chair with a smug grin. Zach, I tell you, you don't know creepy until you've spent some time out here. He then began to tell me a story of when he had first began living out there. He said it took him close to a year to finally assemble his cabin, at least partially. During that time, he and his dogs were living in a simple tent. Mark said that a couple weeks after living there, he started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, he'd awake to find mutilated animals just outside the perimeter of his camp. Usually it was just small creatures like rabbits, birds, and squirrels, but it didn't stay that way. Over time, Mark began finding more and more corpses left at his camp. He thought it was the work of a puma at first, despite the fact that the corpses seemed to retain most of the meat. He quickly rethought that though when he found an actual puma corpse one morning. He said most of the animals had slash marks along their sides and necks, and many had been disemboweled. He began thinking it was the work of some deranged person, but even that thought didn't last long. One night as he was preparing to turn in for the evening, he heard a rustling sound coming from within the forest. He ducked down underneath some timber in hopes of catching a glimpse of the culprit. Both of his dogs were already chained up for the night, so he knew it couldn't be one of them. A figure then emerged deeper in the woods. Mark said he didn't see the entire thing, but he could tell it was bipedal and scrawny. I asked if it could have been a bear with mange, but Mark claimed it was way too skinny for that. He said he'd seen sick bears before, and they looked and moved nothing like that thing. Mark initially planned on trying to shoot it, but after seeing that, he admitted he didn't think that would have been a good idea. The creature dropped something on the perimeter, which Mark discovered the following morning was the corpse of a raccoon. The thing's head then tilted and appeared to stare directly towards Mark. They just stared there in silence for several seconds, until the dogs began snarling voraciously from inside the tent. They must have caught its scent, and the thing suddenly crouched on all fours and dashed off back into the woods as the dogs went ballistic. Mark didn't know what he had seen that night, and apparently never saw it again. To me, it sounded like a Wendigo or skinwalker based on his description. I told him that, but he had no idea what those things were. He seemed to think the thing was actually leaving him gifts, but I wasn't so sure about that. I asked him about the typical creatures as seen in creepypasta and television lore. I mentioned the Wendigo, skinwalkers, Slenderman, the Rake, Siren Head, and some of the well-known others, but Mark didn't seem to know anything about any of them. He did, however, know about something he called the Whistler. Apparently, ever since he had been out there, he heard an odd whistling sound on occasion. It started off as little more than a dull, barely audible noise in the distance. He said at times it would come closer, and at others it seemed like it was further away. Mark thought it was a bird for the longest time, but one night he found the truth. He was chopping wood when suddenly the whistling noise emerged. This time it was different, and this time it was closer than ever before. Suddenly there was a rustling noise from behind him. Mark spun back, but only saw a few branches bristling back and forth. He then heard the whistle again, louder than ever before. He looked up, and there it was. About 20 feet up in a large oak tree was some kind of figure. Mark described it as a kind of human with a head that looked like some fucked-up eel. He said he saw the thing stare down at him with beady black eyes. He just froze, and before he could do anything, the thing suddenly leapt from the tree. It crashed into another one further away, and continued whistling and crashing as it blended into the depths of the woods. I didn't know what to say to that. I have heard legends about the whistlers out in the woods, but never heard about anyone having actually seen them. The way he described it sounded quite creative, and I wondered whether he was capable of an imagination so elaborate or he had actually seen what he claimed. I asked him whether he thought this whistler was the same creature that was leaving him corpses, but he just shook his head. Without being prompted, he told me another tale about hearing voices in the woods sometimes. Sometimes it was that of an old man, sometimes that of a young girl, and sometimes it didn't sound human at all. I wondered whether my new friend was perhaps schizophrenic or suffering from some mental illness that caused him to hear these things. I obviously didn't tell him that, but his claims had to be met with some amount of skepticism. What do you think it was? Mark leaned back, and his head swiveled on his shoulders. No clue, son, and part of me hopes I never find out. He went on to explain that he continued hearing voices on occasion, but never saw or what was making them. He seemed to think all the voices were coming from the same entity, though. Without being prompted, he took the conversation in an entirely new accusatory direction. It's the goddamn government, Zach, messing with things they got no business messing with. He then dealt into a conspiratorial rant about how the government, and specifically the guys in black trucks, that were up to some really shady antics. He said they knew about the gates in the forest and had been actively trying to open them. He didn't elaborate on what exactly he meant by that. You see them out here? You know, government, CIA. Mark looked confused. CIA? He asked. It was my turn to look confused then. Yeah, Central Intelligence Agency? You know, Men in Black, MK Ultra and whatnot. Mark still appeared slightly puzzled. I didn't understand how a guy like him who hated the government to such an extreme degree had apparently never heard of the mother of all conspiracy agencies like the CIA. He then seemed to have an epiphany and his eyes lit up in recognition. Oh yeah, I forgot all about them. He then laughed and shook his head as he downed another swig of ale. My memory of what it used to be, I'm afraid. Goddamn, how could I forget them? Well, in my defense, they don't carry no badges out here. And their vehicles don't exactly advertise who they work for. He paused and rubbed the back of his neck. But you've seen them out here? Mark met my eyes and nodded. Oh yeah. Mark told me that one time he had been tracking elk through the woods in late autumn. He'd followed the trail for a few miles when he suddenly heard a noise coming from a grove up ahead. It sounded nothing like a bear though, and more like several people arguing. Mark crept slowly forward, taking care to not disturb the foliage and remain out of sight. After a couple seconds, he saw the outline of several people emerge in the grove. One man was on his knees in the center, while 4 men in black suits surrounded him. The man on his knees had open wounds and bruises upon his face, and his clothing was torn and tattered. He was begging the others for mercy, but they didn't appear to be the forgiving type. 2 of the men were speaking quietly to one another, while the other 2 stood watch over their apparent captive. The man on his knees was dressed in white, with Mark describing his clothes as looking like a surgeon's uniform, or maybe the attire of someone from an insane asylum. He listened but couldn't make out what the 2 other men were talking about, but they were clearly arguing. The man on his knees appeared to be weeping softly. Mark said he didn't know what to do, and before he could do anything, one of the 2 men who had previously been arguing stepped away. Without a word, the man stepped behind the captive, lifted a pistol to the back of the man in white's head and pulled the trigger. Mark described seeing a splash of red, but said the weapon made a lot less noise than he thought it would. The man in white went limp and fell face first into the dirt. Holy shit, I said, mouth falling agape as Mark concluded his story. I eyed him closely, but didn't see any aura boasting in his eyes. They didn't twinkle like that of a man who tried telling a fabricated story to simply amaze or impress an audience. He didn't meet my gaze at all. As a matter of fact, he just clasped his hands in front of his mouth and stared into the campfire with a somber gaze. It was clear to me that what he was either an accomplished actor, or what he had witnessed truly haunted him. Poor boy couldn't have been much older than you. I wish I would have done something, but I just ran. He shook his head, and his eyes seemed to glaze over. I just stayed quiet, as there was nothing I could think to say. After a couple moments of lingering silence, Mark finally spoke again. Zach, I gotta tell you a secret. He looked in the eye, and I gulped down the lump in my throat. I don't particularly care for the government. I chuckled and Mark let out a small laugh. I think you've mentioned that once or twice. I replied with a laugh. Yeah, suppose I have, but it's not just because the IRS is after my ass. It's because of things like what I saw that day. It's because government corrupts by its very nature. It takes what it wants and destroys those who oppose it. Ain't no justice, no considerations, and nothing you can do about it. Now I don't know the details of what they were disagreeing on that night, but I guarantee you, that boy didn't deserve what he got. I nodded, but wasn't entirely convinced that he witnessed what he thought he had. You sure it was government that did that? Could have been drug dealers or mafia. Mark hunched his shoulders and gave a snide chuckle. What's the difference? I chuckled, but didn't have a response. Well, I see why you'd think that, but that's because you ain't spent as much time out here as I have. But what you don't know, and what no one is supposed to know, is about the tunnels. I peeked an eyebrow at that comment. Tunnels? Mark grinned and nodded back. There are a series of tunnels that run deep below the earth. Gotta be a couple dozen of them within a few miles of us now. Government knows about them. Maybe they built them, but, well, I doubt that. I think they're just interested by what's inside. And that is? I asked, now on the edge of my seat. Mark scoffed and shook his head. I have no idea, but it's gotta be something bad. I was a bit disappointed with that answer, but Mark immediately drew my curiosity back. You want to see one of them? I nodded without even really thinking. Mark grinned. I figured you might. It's a bit late in the day to go now, so what I say we head out there first thing in the morning? I agreed without hesitance and promised to return the next morning to meet up with Mark. I walked back down the trail that day with my imagination running wild. As I mentioned, I liked Mark and very much enjoyed our conversations. To me, he was somewhat like a compassionate grandfather with a plethora of exuberant stories that may or may not have been slightly exaggerated. I thought about all he had told me about the animal carcasses, the whistling thing, the voices, and the tunnels. I wanted to believe him, but urban legends abound in our day and age. I was well aware that perhaps he had just concocted these stories after his decades of isolation. I needed to see some proof for myself. Dew glistened on the leaves illuminated by the crimson sun rising over the hills as I set out the next morning. It was a bit chilly as I walked, but thoughts of the unknown kept me warm as I walked. Before long I arrived at Mark and I's usual meeting spot, and found him already waiting there for me. He greeted me and without hesitation we began the trek out to his spot. We made small talk on the way, mostly about asinine topics like my family and work. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, we rounded a small bend tucked behind a small grove of trees. Mark stepped out in front and turned to face me. He then grinned and outstretched his hand to the right. I followed his gesture and felt my jaw strike the floor. There was an opening in the side of the hill that was lined with smooth stone and bricks. It was quite enormous, with the perimeter having to have been at least 15 feet wide. The opening appeared collapsed and the entrance was filled with rubble and dirt, looking as though someone had intentionally yet clumsily sealed it. This is the tunnel? I asked. Mark nodded. One of many, but it wasn't sealed up like this last time I was here. How long ago was that? Mark shrugged. Dunno, maybe a year or two. I looked back at the collapsed tunnel. It was clear someone had gone through a great deal of effort to construct it, but the construction didn't look like a mining operation. I'm no expert in mining or anything, but I can't imagine they would spend time laying brick and creating such a wide entrance. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the more curious fact was why it had been sealed up. I thought maybe it was just vandals, but that explanation somehow didn't satisfy. What's inside? I asked. Mark paused for a moment and stared towards the wreckage. He then shook his head and spat into the dirt. Bad things. I hoped he'd elaborate on that, but he didn't. I mean, it'd have to be for someone to seal it up like this, right? That's an impressive hole. Would have taken a great deal of effort. He was right about that, but I still felt there was information he was withholding from me. You think this is the government's work? Mark nodded. Not a single doubt in my mind about it. Mark's head then suddenly flicked to the side and he stared out into the trees as if something had alerted him. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as his mouth pursed open. We should go. I don't like lingering here for too long. I didn't argue, as clearly something had spooked him. He and I trekked back to his cabin, checking his snares on the way back. Mark found a pair of rabbits in his traps, and after swiftly snapping their necks, he slung them over his shoulder. We got back to his cabin, and Mark set to work on harvesting the meat from the rabbits for his stew. I sat around, petting Daisy and Lally as they slobbered all over my knee and panted endlessly. I don't think I ever told you about the scariest part of living out here, did I? Mark asked. I looked up from the two dogs and stared at him, heart now beating with excitement. Mark sauntered over, tearing the meat of the rabbits along with a clump of chopped vegetables. He dumped a plate into the simmering cauldron on the fire, then took a seat across the fire. I stayed silent as he stared down at the flickering flames in deep thought. There are things out there that people don't know about. Creatures, places, and things that would seem to defy all explanation. The advancement of society and technology has led people to believe they're safe, and for the most part, they're right. So long as they stay out of the woods, those things can't get them, but there is something that can. Mark paused and looked me dead in the eye. I call it the silence dot. He paused as if to allow the words to accumulate the dread he felt they deserved. I had an inkling of an idea where the conversation was headed, but just waited for him to explain. There's been rumors about it for a very long time, and it's something that has been affecting humanity for centuries, if not millennia. People have only just begun to realize it, but if they knew the true extent of what's going on, well, no one would ever go into the woods again. He paused and leaned in to stir the pot a bit before sitting back. People disappear, Zach. No reason for it, no explanation, and no bodies are ever found. The cases seem to defy all explanation, and it happens again and again. Mark then suddenly grunted and began rubbing his eye. Damn smoke. Sorry. Or was I? The disappearances. I replied. Mark seemed suddenly hesitant, as if he didn't know whether he should continue. Yeah, the disappearances. I don't particularly like talking about this if I'm being honest. It's not really my business, but you're a good kid, Zach, and I know you come out here a lot, and I'd be devastated if anything were to happen to you. Dread crept around me like dozens of little spiders scurrying on my flesh. I couldn't help but raise my guard and wonder where exactly this conversation was headed. Mark went on to tell me about this silence he mentioned. He said if ever I was walking through the woods and everything went completely silent, I was to drop to my knees and put my face in the dirt immediately. He said to stay that way until sounds returned to normal. And what if the sound doesn't come back? I asked, spine-tingling with anxiety. Mark looked me dead in the eye, and his words offered nothing of comfort. Then God help you. He said no more about the subject, and I didn't push him on it. It was clear he really wasn't comfortable discussing it beyond his initial warning. If he had any theories about what was responsible, he didn't voice them. The whole conversation had given me strong missing 411 vibes, and I wondered whether he was referring to the same phenomenon. Both of us just sort of lingered in silence for a while as the stew finished cooking. A few minutes later, Mark leaned in and scooped 2 servings into bowls, handing one of them to me. The stew was delicious as usual, and I happily scarfed it down as Mark provided his hounds with their dinner as well, although didn't so much as nibble on his own serving. What do you know about mimics? I don't know why exactly I asked, but the thought had suddenly arisen in my mind. Mark seemed to perk up, but he had stared back with a look of confusion that seemed to contradict his reaction. I'm sorry, what? Mimics. I clarified. Some people call them imposters or liars. Things that look and try to act human but aren't. Mark stared back at me, and a small grin slithered onto his face. Now what would make you ask a question like that? Mark's grin evaporated and he stared back with something akin to contempt. Truth is, some of the things I'd seen from him made me question who he claimed he was. There was just a subtle oneness to him in a way I've never felt the words to accurately describe. Just curious, I replied, staring back. Mark chuckled, but without any humor in his tone. Your kind always is. Ever since your brothers took up arms against one another in the War of Grey and Blue, your curiosity has been quite insatiable. You think this land belongs to you, like this country is your own personal proving grounds to pillage and destroy as you please. His form seemed to shift as he spoke, his eyes shrinking in their sockets and his skin seemed to twitch. His teeth bared like the fangs of a cougar, and his long black hair flowing like a clump of wild eels. He leaned forward, in a gaze that no longer seemed entirely human. Zach, there are things out here that your world of science and logic will never understand. And these things are better left alone. He and I just stared at one another, and I felt my heart beginning to thump away in my chest. I thought about his words, the War of Grey and Blue. Could he have been referring to the American Civil War? Why reference that event specifically? What year did you say you moved out here? I asked. Mark grinned again, now appearing more menacing than ever before. 96. 18. 96. I shook my head. I don't understand, I replied, shaking my head. Your kind never does. His voice had suddenly changed, becoming much more high-pitched like that of a young girl. His head cocked to the side, and his grin grew almost literally year to year as his mouth stretched impossibly wide. Your kind has conquered this world, both beast and nature bow at your might. You live in comfort, convinced that there is nothing that can hurt you anymore. His voice had changed again, sounding like a raspy, Scottish man with rolled R's. But you are wrong. His voice had changed again, like that of a young, rebellious boy resisting his parents' wishes in a juvenile defiance. Mark then stood, and his form extended, making him tower over me in the campsite. Even Daisy and Raleigh started altering their form, like they were also simply hiding their true form. I rose and backed away, no longer seeing Mark as the friendly hermit I had known him to be. I thought that moment would be my end, and that the beast which hid itself in the form of Mark was prepared to devour me whole. Before he did, I had one final question I had to ask. What are you? Mark chuckled, his form continuing to grow abhorrently inhuman. He then shook his monstrous head. Wrong question, his words bellowed forth, spoken in the chorus of 1,000 voices all in unison. I took another step back, wondering what he could have meant by that. It then struck me. What do you want? The thing I had once known as Mark stared down at me with an entirely inhuman gaze. To watch and protect, we stared at one another, and I attempted to understand what was happening. After all he had told me, and his time devoted to actually speaking with me, part of me almost wanted to believe his words were meant to reassure me. Like he was conveying that it was me, or more generally humanity as a whole, he wished to protect. After ruminating on it for a while though, I don't think that's the case anymore. Why are you telling me all this? The thing I had once known as Mark grinned, as if that was the question he was waiting to hear. So that you can tell the world. And so, I have. I left Mark and that trail behind, and I have not been back since. That's why I'm here now, to tell the world as the thing I once knew as Mark instructed me to. I don't even know why or what exactly I'm supposed to be telling. Maybe that Mark is not human and that there are things in the woods that will never be fully understood. Or maybe that he is watching, and something has given him a great deal of power for some reason. I wish I had more answers, but I had to share this, regardless of whether anyone will believe it. And needless to say, I don't think I'll be visiting Mark again anytime soon.